Right, hi everyone. Just give it just a little bit of time while I just do some housekeeping stuff while everyone else is arriving. I'm aware that this is obviously the third one of these that I'm doing so far this season, so numbers are going to be a little bit lower because a lot of people attended the first ones. So my name's Sarah Shuttleworth. I'm the volunteer manager for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. I'm here today to do a little webinar on kind of why the NPMS was started, what it's about, and go into detail on the methodology so that you are fully prepared for your surveys. Just a little bit of housekeeping stuff. I'll just go on to the first slide just to so you can see that. So this is a webinar, so unlike Zoom meetings, you won't be able to turn on your camera, or I won't be able to see or hear you. But if you have any specific problems or you want to just say hi to fellow NPMS people, then do use the chat. I'm not going to be able to monitor the chat as well as I can normally because I'm here on my own today. But if you've got any questions, then there's a Q&A function that you can put your questions in, and I'll have a little session at the end where I'll go through everyone's questions and see if I can answer them as best to my ability. Right, so I will begin. So just to give you a kind of an outline of what we're here to do today, I'm going to give you a bit of a background about the NPMS and why it was started, then how you get started as a volunteer and leading on to the detailed methodology. And we'll go through to how you carry out your surveys, plot selection and creation, and doing the survey actually on the ground. And I'll also detail the kind of support that you can get for these processes. So the NPMS is a UK-wide citizen science, so that means it's obviously science that's done by volunteers. Habitat-based, so although it says National Plant Monitoring Scheme, we're actually looking at whole habitats really. Plant monitoring scheme that covers the major freshwater and terrestrial semi-natural habitats, and the key there is semi-natural. So the NPMS provides an indication of changes in plant diversity and abundance across the UK's habitats through time, and that's the key thing. It's a long-term monitoring project. And there was really a need for this sort of standardized approach for plant monitoring, which was actually identified by the JNCC in their terrestrial biodiversity surveillance strategy, which was published in 2008. So the basis of the NPMS is that across the UK, monads, or simply 1 kilometre squares, have been randomly designated, but with a view to where there is semi-natural habitat. And volunteers across the UK can then allocate themselves one or more of these squares to survey twice a year. So the National Plant Monitoring Scheme was designed and developed by a partnership between BSBI, UKCEH, JNCC, excuse me, and Plant Life. So JNCC, for anyone who doesn't know, stands for Joint Nature Conservation Committee, and it's the public body that advises the UK government and devolved administrations on UK-wide and international nature conservation. The UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, so UKCEH, is an independent, not-for-profit research institute carrying out environmental science across land, sea and air. And the BSBI stands for the Botanical Society for Britain and Ireland, is a botanical society for anyone interested in flora of Britain and Ireland. And now recently we also have Northern Irish partners, DAERA, so the Department of Agriculture and Environment and Rural Affairs for Northern Ireland. So the NPMS provides an indication of changes, as I said, in plant diversity and abundance, and that's through the habitats through time. So there were currently no long-standing monitoring schemes. I mean, there's been some, but not to this sort of level and standard across the UK. And there are already existing monitoring projects for things like bats and birds and butterflies. So, for example, you might have heard of the British Bird Survey, the British Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, but there wasn't anything really like that for plants, which is crazy when you think about it, because they're the foundation of all of these sort of other ecosystems and things. So with major changes taking place and declines in biodiversity across habitats being reported, so for example, habitat change, nutrient enrichment, climate change, etc., it became crucial to have a bit of a better understanding of what plant populations are actually doing. So there was and is still need for a large-scale systematic approach Otherwise, you're going to miss the trends and the patterns. So the 4 partners mentioned in the previous slide came together in 2012 to devise the scheme and the methodologies. A pilot was then run in 2014 using volunteers on the ground to do it. And in 2015, it was officially launched, so making 2021 the 7th year the scheme has run and data has been collected. So last year, 2020, was a really pivotal year for the scheme. Not great timing with COVID anyway, as we now had enough data to really sort of start to looking at stories and trends and indicators and what was going on. And we needed that 5 years of data to be able to start doing the analysis. So as I said, there was no robust survey for plants, so there was the need to establish the scheme. And it was really needed to look beyond those within protected sites, so not triple SIs and things like that. I mean, although they are included within the scheme, we need to look at all habitats, whether they're ones that are being managed for wildlife or not, really. So looking at what the data can tell us in the future, the scheme aims to provide habitat inventories and contribute to something called remote sensing. The aims also include investigating these drivers of change. So we're going to be looking specifically at things like climate change. And obviously it's very relevant this year as we've got COP26 happening in November. And we're going to be taking on a new ecological modeller in a couple of weeks who's going to be looking specifically at some of these things with the data set. Looking at habitat management, invasive species, pollution, eutrophication, which is sort of the effect of nutrients in water systems, for example, coastal management, pests and pathogens, I suppose we could be thinking about ash dieback with that, protected areas and animal plant interactions. So here's just a few sort of little facts and figures for you and numbers. So there are 408 species within the NPMS that are marked as indicators, whether that be positive or negative. There are 11 broad habitats, which are then split down into the 28 fine habitats. We've got the 5 partners that I mentioned. On average, well, not on average, we ask for 5 plots per square. I'll get into more detail about that, but sometimes it is much lower depending on your square. There are the 3 recording levels, which makes this quite a unique monitoring scheme. So you can be a real beginner or you can be a plant expert. We've currently got 1,600 volunteers that are allocated a square, and we ask for the 2 visits to your plots each year. So monitoring these NPMS habitat plots twice a year, every year, really provides an unparalleled opportunity to track and understand the responses of plants and their communities to the changing environment, as I mentioned. So it allows us to investigate growing pressures and changes. And obviously, after the 5 years worth of data, as I said, we finally had enough to start looking at some real sort of effects and analysis of the data. So last year, March 2020, just before lockdown number 1, our report, Understanding the Health of Our Habitats, was released. The whole full report is on the website, so you can go and it's underneath conservation and research on the website. And do have a read because it's quite interesting. It tells you lots about what's going on with our plant communities, and you can read it with the knowledge that the data you'll be collecting will be feeding directly into these kinds of areas of work. So another major achievement last year was that we were able to produce an experimental indicator. So to explain that a little bit better, during the end of last year, DEFRA and JNCC published their UK biodiversity indicators. And these are sort of provide an annual view of how a wide variety of groups of wildlife and other indicators of action for biodiversity conservation have fared basically in recent years. So 2020 obviously was the landmark year because it was the first time NPMS volunteers had ever contributed to a national biodiversity indicator. So the data from 4 of the scheme's best surveyed broad habitats have been used to create a new indicator category, C7, plants of the wider countryside. Again, you can use the QR code to scan there and it will take you to the document produced all about this. Otherwise, again, the links are there under our conservation and research page. So it's still classified as an experimental indicator, and that's just because they need to do more work on using it and using it in analysis. However, it's really quite incredible to get to that point in only 6 years of field surveys, and it really highlights the dedication of the volunteers getting out there and being part of that data collection. So now heading into the 7th year, as I said, with huge potential for more future analysis. And with this new ecological modeler coming on board soon, we're going to really be able to start telling some interesting stories, maybe not always positive, but you've got to know it in order to protect these places. So this is just a little infographic to explain a bit about that indicator. So those are the 4 broad scale habitats that were included. So arable field margins, bog and wet heath, broadleaved woodland and hedges, and lowland grassland. And basically obviously at this point is not telling us a huge amount, but these are going to be used to measure the sort of health of those types of habitats over time, and that can be applied for years and years to come. So that'll be really useful. So as you can see on the map, you've got all the NPMS squares, and they're either orange, which means they've already been allocated to a volunteer, or they're blue, which means they're currently unallocated. So as I said, we've currently got 1,615 volunteers allocated a square. Some volunteers do take on more than one square. You're more than happy to do. We do limit it to 5, but I think that's quite unusual anyway. So you may have seen the map that looks like this on the website when you're on the page for Square Near Me. As you can see, there are still a lot of patches of blue, but these tend to be in particularly the more sort of remote areas further away from habitation, or they're difficult to access. So we are working on ways to encourage a greater uptake of some of these squares in the remote areas. We're working with organisations such as the Mountain Training Association, Cairngorms National Parks, Snowdonia Society, Lake District and Peak District National Parks. So they will hopefully be taken up more in the future. It's worth mentioning at this point, if you've gone to look for a square and you found that they're basically all orange near you, which can be a little bit demoralizing, which means they're already allocated, please don't be too disheartened. Squares are released fairly frequently by volunteers. They're either leaving the scheme or they've moved geographically, so they're going to be taking on a square elsewhere and leaving that one behind. Sometimes volunteers are also thrilled by the idea of sharing a square with somebody, because they'd like to do it in sort of a buddy system. Or perhaps they actually have taken it on, but life has gotten in the way. They haven't had a chance to release it. And when I contact them, they're more than happy to give it to somebody else. So do contact us if you can't find one near you that's suitable. We also have plans to release more squares in areas, particularly at the moment where there's more than 80% take up of squares. So I do believe we're about to release some more down in the southeast soon. It's worth noting that I do get sometimes quite a few people requesting squares to be placed in a certain area, or they'd like to, there's a lovely nature reserve and we'd love to have one set up here. Unfortunately, the methodology of the scheme means that these squares have to be sort of semi-randomized, which means that they are taking into account where there's semi-natural habitat, but they can't be selected by anybody. It's sort of a computer has to do it. Otherwise, there's just going to be too much site selection bias, basically, and it will affect the results, and we'll end up getting sort of not the true representation of what's going on. So it's a difficult one. So to revisit, the aim is to provide sort of reliable measures of change for individual species and species groups within semi-natural habitat. It's using both positive and negative indicator species for each habitat. The species that were chosen as indicators for the scheme, and there's a whole scientific document that you can read that I'm happy to send to anyone, which explains exactly how the species were chosen, but it's based loosely on which ones are reliable indicators, so which ones are going to actually tell you the data that you need. The species that are widespread and can be found within most of the UK and are relatively easy to identify, because basically the survey design needed to be straightforward as much as possible, repeatable and achievable by volunteers. So just to sort of brief over the basics before I go into the details, once a surveyor or a volunteer has allocated themselves a randomly placed 1 kilometre square, they are then to establish 5 plots, ideally 3 square and 2 linear, but do not worry, I will go into more details about this. It can be flexible on that. Plots should represent different NPMS habitats if possible, and surveyors then record the abundance of indicator species and any other background information, and this survey is carried out twice a year, once in late spring or early summer and then again in late summer. Now, a lot of people have already been going out and doing their first surveys, which is fantastic, but do not worry if obviously you're new to the scheme and of course you haven't managed to get your first survey done yet. because spring is incredibly late. I mean, really late. As well as a botanist, I'm also a lepidopterist, and I'm really into my moths. And I'm getting absolutely nothing really in the moth trap at the moment, and it's a little concerning, but spring is very, very late. The plants just aren't growing as well as they were. We're suddenly getting a big bit of growth now, but it's cold. It was very dry in April. We've obviously had a lot of rain. So don't worry if your first survey is going to be more like end of June. That's absolutely no problem at all. So once a volunteer has requested and been allocated a square, they then receive a welcome pack with the survey guidance notes, which details the methodology. And it's worth pointing out that those survey guidance notes, if you ever have a question, obviously you can contact me, but I guarantee most of the time it will be answered in that book because they do go into a lot of detail. And sometimes it's very easy to sort of read through your guidance notes and almost skim read it. So if you do have a query, do go back and have a really good look at it. We then have the species ID guide and the species lists for each habitat, the survey forms, and a map of your 1 kilometre square. So the ID books were specifically created for the scheme because it's only those 408 species that are within the scheme that's within the book. It's not a full ID guide. So therefore, volunteers do and can supplement with their own ID books of choice. I'll go into a little bit more detail about other books that I could potentially recommend. The guidance notes explains the details of the methodology. The species list show which species are to be recorded for each habitat, dependent on the surveyor level. And also the recording forms, which are tucked in at the back there, once used in the field, can then be used for uploading the data straight onto the website. And the forms on the website look very similar to the form that you're filling in, so it's sort of asking the same questions. However, we do have an updated version of the app now, which can be used to directly record all of that data in the field. And I will go into more detail about that towards the end. It's worth noting that presently, if any of you are new to the scheme and you've had your requested square approved, which I do once a week, you will likely have received only a digital copy at this point. That's because I've only just been allowed back in the office because it was closed from the first week in January because of lockdown. Therefore, I am going through once a week, I'm going through and sending out lots and lots of packs, and it does take a bit of time, but you will get your pack soon, I promise. Oh, I went too far. Apologies. So we always recommend that it's worth doing a sort of reconnaissance of your square to visit your NPMS habitats and potentially establish where plots should be. So check there aren't already previously allocated plots in your square. So if you've taken on a new square, you can go onto the website and have a look for view and create plots and enter data, and then the next one down is view square and create plots. You can go within that, and if there are plots already set up for your square, they will be listed there. So it is worth checking that. Obviously, if it's a brand new square or nobody surveyed it previously, then there's probably nothing there and you're going to have to start from scratch on that. So using initially footpaths, lanes, and using your OS map or maybe an app on your phone that can guide you around, you can start to get a picture of what your square is like on the ground and maybe who owns parts of it too. What's the access like, where the NPMS habitats are or extend to. And this is also a really good time to sort of locate the existing plots that are on the square map with the numbers on, which I will go into more detail on that as well. And it can also be really useful to have a look at satellite maps, for example, Google Street View, before you start heading out. I know that I do this pretty much before I go anywhere these days, just to check where I need to park and where the access is like, etc. So it can give you a lot of information of how to get about your square. So there's another aspect that you need to start considering, and that's the landowner permission side of things. So I find the best way to do this is to use a combination of OS maps online to locate your square by putting in your square ID. So for example, if the map that you've got, it's got the square ID at the top. So I'm going to use an example, SP2546. You can actually type that into OS Maps online in their little bit for locating an area, and it will take you straight to where your 1 kilometre square is. Equally, on the website, obviously for viewing squares, it's got your square with the satellite mapping and the outline of your square on it that you can zoom in and out of. you can then also use Google Maps, as I said before, and you can see if there are any obvious addresses or businesses or farms, for example. And as I said, the NPMS website also has the satellite map with your square on it. And it also, which not often people see, it has a little plus sign in the side, which means it can turn on different layers. And there's layers there for where boundaries of triple SIs, areas of outstanding natural beauty, national parks, that sort of thing. So it's worth ticking some of those off, because it might be that some of your square falls in with an ANO area of outstanding natural beauty or a triple SI, in which case you're going to know that you need to either contact Natural England or maybe the local sort of national park or something like that. And that will be a good sort of starting point. So another option, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in the next slide, is using Land Registry. Now, you can use the website free of charge, and you don't need to pay the £3, and we would never expect you to pay for a title deed. But if I show you what you need to do, so this is just to give you an example of what the Land Registry map looks like. So find a property map inquiry. It'll ask you if you're a robot, and you just say no. And then you can use the map to sort of zoom in and out to where you need to go. As you can see, this is sort of how an OS map would look. And basically what you need to do is zoom in so close. I mean, you imagine that this is probably designed more for finding houses and that sort of property address. So it's designed to be zoomed in really close, because you have to zoom in close enough so that when it says find properties, you can actually switch on the on. Because at the moment, currently down here, I'm too zoomed out and it won't let me turn that on because it's sort of grayed out. So you have to zoom right in, and you can turn on, and then you can literally click on the screen and it will come up with the address that's sort of associated with that area just down below that's in that red square. So for here, it's got this address here, and basically it's got nobody's details, like it hasn't got Mr. and Mrs. Smith associated to it, that you would have to pay the £3 for to get the title register. But if you've got an address for a farm, then that's going to be good enough. So you could certainly use that, and that's how I find out a lot of my land owner information for people when they do ask for help. So it's worth having a go at this first for yourself. It is also worth saying that I can help with this stage if anyone is stuck. So, and if needs be, and we don't get the address there, then I can pay the £3 and find the title deeds. So the main points to consider when thinking about plots is that we suggest you aim for the 3 square, which are 5 by 5 metre plots, and 2 linear plots, which are 1 by 25 metres. So the pre-selected plot locations are we recommend that you do those if possible, to avoid that site selection bias. So I'll come on to that pre-selected plots in a minute. So survey should only be carried out in NPMS habitats, as I said. So not on, I don't know, trying to think of an example. So we don't want in the middle of an arable field. You don't want to do a woodland that's been planted with all conifers, because it's going to, managed for forestry. That's what it needs to be semi-natural. And they should ideally be in different NPMS habitats across the square, but that is definitely not always that easy, so no worries. So it's really hard if basically your square has no different NPMS habitat within it, or the whole square is only one NPMS habitat type, which can happen for some of our upland regions, heathlands, for example, particularly if you've had your square in the post and it's all purple because it's all heathland. That's going to be very difficult to do it in different NPMS habitats, obviously. So firstly, it's worth kind of bearing in mind that the mapping data that we use to generate those maps that we send to you can sometimes be inaccurate and not give a true representation of what's on the ground. That's why we suggest the square reconnaissance is really important. So don't assume that there isn't any NPMS habitat if it doesn't have it listed, because there probably is. And Google Maps can help with that as well. You can see where there's pockets of woodland or a nice hedgerow that you could go and look at, for example. So yeah, on average, there's about 4 plots per square that are done. So some people do contact us and say, well, I can't get 5 plots done in my square because it's almost all built up, and and so fine. Just if you can get 2 in, that would be brilliant. If you've got a good square, ideally try and do the 5, because that's obviously what we need for the data analysis side of things. So it does sound like I'm sort of spouting off lots of strict rules and reasons for doing things, but basically it's to ensure that we have really statistically robust data, and ultimately that's why we're all getting involved. So just to give you a brief overview of how 5 survey plots are selected within the monads. So the square maps provided to each volunteer might look a bit like this. So you can see that there are pre-selected numbered plot locations that are basically randomized, but as you can see, they're trying to land within where there's NPMS habitat. And the 1 kilometre grid squares, as I said, are selected with a bias towards where there's semi-natural habitats. So it's possible, so if it's possible, we recommend that you use these numbered plot locations. As you can imagine, if we were always able to choose our exact plot locations, we may very well end up choosing the rather nice patch of orchids in the corner of the grassland. And as lovely as that would be, if you scaled that up nationally, this would give a misrepresentation of what really happening in our habitats. If your plot is boring, we understand that this can be frustrating, but that's why we go on visits to nature reserves and for lovely walks. And that's to send in, we can send in our records to iRecord or to your local recorder. But what we're doing here, it's science. We're doing this. We're monitoring, and we want to know. So if it's boring and you've got no indicator species in your plot, then as sad as that is, it's still vital information to be collected. But by all means, if your walk there, you found an early purple orchid and this, that, and the other, brilliant. Take photos, share it on social media, put that record into iRecord. That's also important. Yeah, so another thing in the guidance notes that you'll probably come across is Protocol A, which is regarding self-selecting plots. So this can be done if there are reasons why you cannot use the numbered ones. So these could be from factors like safety, access, where NPMS habitat is. And Protocol A suggests that you locate your plot in the NPMS habitat, but in specifically an area that most represents the rest of that habitat, that's sort of typical or average. So if you had to set it up in a bit of lowland grassland, for example, you're going to want to select it in the part of the grassland that you think is most averagely like the rest of it. You're not going to want to do it maybe by the gate where there's lots of pioneer species, or underneath a really tall hedge, because then you're going to get shading and less sort of the similar species. So it would just be using that sort of, where do I think I could set one up that would be average for the rest of it. So this grid plan crib sheet can be downloaded off the NPMS website, and it helps to show you how to locate those numbered plots. So by using the numbers along each side and the number ID for your square, you can then get an accurate grid reference for that plot, which then you can use a GPS device if you have one, or just an app on your phone, a grid reference finder app, and then you can actually locate that plot on the ground, bearing in mind that this can sometimes be variable in accuracy. So a GPS unit is going to be more accurate than a phone, but we've got to do with what we've got. I don't own a GPS device, for example. So as you can see, for this one, they've got an example here. So the grid ID number is TL1234. So in order to get the accurate grid reference for the plot, they've simply gone along the bottom here to 333.33 meters, and they've gone up to where, so I think they're looking for number 12 here, and so it's at 500, and then they've simply added those numbers to the 12 and the 34, and they've got that full 10-figure grid reference, and that's going to give you a pretty accurate location of where you need to be. So you'd have your phone open with the grid reference finder app, and you'd basically be watching the numbers on the screen because it will give you the location of where you are, and you walk around until that number, as accurately as possible, matches the one that you're looking for, and then you'll know that you're in that numbered plot location. It's worth also mentioning that ideally, we'd like you to set up the square plots on the numbered locations that are within the boundaries of one of these inner squares. So for example, here, number 11, 13, 23, 21, they are ideal places to set up your square plots. And then the ones that are on the internal grid lines are an ideal spot for setting up one of your linear plots. But that can be very dependent on whether there's a linear feature that actually crosses that grid line at that point. So for example, if we were looking at number 18 and we had a hedgerow that really nicely crossed that grid line, you'd want to start your plot at the 18 point and go 25 meters in the direction the hedge goes south, say in that instance. If, however, your hedgerow is more like between 18 and 19, but it crosses the grid line, then by all means, just record the plot location for where the hedge starts at the grid line and do your plot 25 meters there. It doesn't matter if it's not exactly bang on the 18 point. These are just where we'd ideally like you to sort of start looking from at that point. Hopefully I've explained that. So a quick overview of the plot setup. So whilst on site, you want to use fixed landmarks to record the plot location and set up only temporary markers. Obviously, countryside code and all that, we don't want to leave anything behind. So then you want to record the grid reference for the southwest corner of your plot. I'll go into more detail in a minute. Your plot sketch and a written description. The more you can write and blabble on about exactly there's this rock shaped like a heart here and there's a tree stump that looks like an owl over there, you know, that will all help not only yourself for finding your plot next year, but if you were to leave your square behind and somebody else was to take it on, they're going to be able to find your plot as well. We also then say to take a photograph each year from the same point and angles of your plot, because that can be useful data for us, but also it's very useful for you for finding it as well. Linear plots can be along an arable field margin, hedgerow, or a watercourse. There's all the guidance on that in the guidance notes. So for a watercourse, for example, it has to be big, wider than the 1 meter point. So unfortunately, tiny little streams and things just won't really work. Woodland plots are larger at 10 by 10 meters, and the plot setup has to be done on the website basically before you can start entering the data. So by all means, go out there and set it up and figure out exactly where it's going to be, just like all these people have done here. But before you can actually start putting the data in for those plots, it has to be set up with the plot location, grid reference and everything on the website. But I mean, once that's done the first year, if you're planning on surveying this square for years to come, you don't need to do it again. It's all done. You literally just turn up to find your plot again and survey it and enter the data in. So there's a lot of support and guidance on this stage. So I produced a YouTube video, which I'll go through in a bit more detail in a minute. And we're also going to be doing lots of other in-field sort of help guides and how to do all of these various things. So keep watching. So this is my trusty kit for setting up my plot. So I have my weather writer clipboard. It has a little bit of mold on it from all the plant specimens that I stuffed into it over the years. I have the marked bamboo canes, which up to you how you do this. That I just found that was the easiest way. I had them sort of laying around in the garden, just tore up some scraps of fabric to make them sort of visible at the top. I always take a ball of wool, as it's, you know, I don't have string long enough. I also pre-measure it at the 5 meter intervals and sort of mark it at that 5 meter point on the string, just with another scrap of fabric. And that's really, really useful. So then you want to use the little kit that you have to place an initial marker in one of the corners. And then you measure the first side of your square using your pre-measured string tape measure, or you can paste it out, it's worth mentioning. The clipboard basically is used to create the 90-degree angle at each corner so that you don't end up with a sort of wonky parallelogram type shape instead of a nice square. And then it's in the southwest corner that you take your photo, as we talked about, you draw your sketch of the plot and you take your grid reference. So that's how you do it. Oh, slides being funny. So as you can see, this is where I was just doing a demo in my garden. But basically I put my first marker in and then I use the clipboard in the corner to make sure I'm getting a nice straight line, and I tie it around each way. And you can either paste it out or you can use your pre-measured yarn there. And then what you end up with is a lovely shaped plot at the end. So as I was explaining, there's currently a YouTube video that watches me do this exact thing in the field. So do go and have a look. Our YouTube channel is called NPMS Support. If you subscribe to it, which doesn't mean you pay, by the way, it just means that you'll get updates of when new videos come out. And throughout the season, I will be doing a whole set of species ID videos, as well as methodology stuff and updates. Yeah, so you can watch that and you will actually see me setting up a plot in a field exactly, and then you should be able to follow how I do it. So most linear plots, which I do cover a little bit of in the video as well, are 1 by 25 meters for mostly arable field margins, standing and running water. So running water makes sense that it would be in an arable linear plot, apologies. But actually ponds are also a linear plot. So it has to be a fairly big size pond because you have to go around the outside of it. Ideally, you want these linear plots to cover the part of the feature that intersects with the internal boundary grid line, as I was saying. Also, you can do road verges and hedgerows, and also rock outcrops and screes. So you can actually do vertical linear plots, and there's a slightly different measurements for that. But again, it talks about it in the guidance notes. So your plot should start at the point where the feature intersects and then from any direction from there. And you want to use 2 markers to establish the 1 meter width. And then using the cord, the rope, the tape measure, or pacing it out 25 meters in length. And you use your GPS or your grid reference finder on your app on your phone to get your specific grid reference for the start and the finishing point for your linear plot. And you want to take a photo sort of from the outside of your plot looking at it. If the linear feature is shorter than 25 meters, then just record the entirety of it and make a note of how long it is. There's separate sections in the guidance notes on linear features for vertical plots for rock outcrops, etc., as I said. And there are further details about linear arable field margins. So there's a little bit of a picture here which sort of describes that you want to be looking at the cultivated area of the crop. So some lovely farms may have an extra strip that's sown with cornfield annual species or pollinator crops or for bird seeds, that sort of thing. And as lovely as that is, and it's fantastic for nature, it's not technically semi-natural because somebody's planted the seeds. So you want to make sure that you're recording the area that's actually cultivated regularly within the crop line. Um, and also it's worth noting that we don't biofuel crops such as willow farming wouldn't be included as an arable one. But I did have somebody ask recently about a vineyard, which of course we're getting more and more of these in the UK. And at first I thought, no, surely we wouldn't include a vineyard because it's not cultivated. But actually they do cultivate the soil in between, and it had lots and lots of wild flowers that were native arable species. So yeah, if you're ever unsure, just contact us, send us some pictures, and we can evaluate each individual situation. So just to recap, you've done your square recce, you have your landowner permissions for the areas that need it, and you've chosen which plots you want to use, and you've set them up on the website and all of that. So this is just showing you where you would do your little sketch map and the photo for each plot. So all of that can be done before the survey, or maybe you want to do another square recce before, or maybe as you start your survey, basically. But either way, as I mentioned, once you're back at the computer, you'll need to set up your plots on the website first. Basically, there's a lot of guidance on how to do this as well. On our YouTube channel, there's a video of watching somebody set up their plots on the website. We've also got our webinar on data entry and plot setup and everything, which is already on there, but we'll be repeating that again. But yeah, so you can watch how to step-by-step process on how to do that, essentially. So as I mentioned, each volunteer needs to decide which level they're going to record at before they start recording in the field. So all the forms and the app can be used for any of the levels. So there's no separate forms for the different levels. So wildflower level is the sort of starter level, entry level, if you want to call it, with 212 easily identifiable species. I mean, I say easily identifiable. Some of them are still challenging, and I admit that. And approximately sort of 10 to 15 species per habitat need to be identified. At indicator level, sort of our intermediate, is an expanded list of 408 species divided into groups applicable for habitats, including some species which are more challenging to identify. So there's a few grasses, sedges, ferns, etc., more like maybe 30 species per habitat. And then there's inventory level, which is your sort of your top level, which is designed for volunteers who are capable of recording all the vascular plant species which they find in that habitat. And that includes when they're not in flower as well. So wildflower, as I said, is relatively simpler level, and there's a reduced list. So if we look at an example, dry deciduous woodland, which is a fine habitat, it has 20 species that need to be identified. So these include species like wild garlic, hazel, cleavers, ivy, holly, etc. All fairly, sort of well-known woodland species. Whereas at indicator level, there's an expanded list to record, for example, 30 in dry deciduous woodland. So there's the addition of wood sedge, wood millet, wood speedwell, for example. And then inventory level, as I said, is recording all the species present that are within the plot. So there are 11 broad habitat categories, as you can see down this side. Things ranging from arable field margins, heathland, marsh and fen, even the sort of Scottish native pine woods, that sort of thing. And then those are then broken down into a subset of fine scale habitats. So when we're looking at coast here, it's are you in coastal salt marsh or a maritime cliff top? Or, if we're looking at fresh water, is it a river and a stream, or is it, one of the sort of nutrient rich or nutrient poor lakes? And then a range of positive and negative indicator species, which are selected, as I said, between a compromise of their reliability as indicators, how widespread they are, and how easy to identify. So if you have very few indicator species, the information is still really important, as I mentioned. And you might want to record other species that you definitely and this information is still useful, but it won't be used to assess the change in habitat quality, but it's still putting in records. It's worth noting that your habitat could change over time, depending on how it's managed, so it's worth taking that into account. So this is obviously the copy of the survey guidance notes, and towards the back it has the full list of broad scale and fine scale habitats with a little description for each one. So if you're unsure, have a read of that. And it has some photos as well. So I'll just briefly go into those different habitats. So for example, here we've got the Broadleaf Woodland, which I've just done a little video on the dry deciduous woodland fine habitat within this. And it's fairly easy to tell which broadleaf woodland you've got, whether you've got a wet woodland or a dry deciduous woodland. There's quite a few differences in species, and that's all detailed in our guidance notes. And obviously, if it's a hedgerow, it's a hedgerow. And the reason it says native species because we don't want you to be doing the hedgerows that are around the Sainsbury's car park or something that's been planted as part of the development. So then we've got things like native pinewood and juniper scrub, which we had a whole webinar with Ben Averis, and that there's already up on the YouTube channel for that. We've also had the arable field margins webinar this year. That's again already on YouTube. You can watch that at any point. We're also covering the lowland grassland fine scale habitats. So we've already had dry acid grassland. Coming up this Friday, we have the neutral damp grassland and pastures all as one. And that's with Dominic Price. And also he'll be doing in a couple of weeks after that, the dry calcareous grassland. Then we've got upland grasslands, so montane acid and montane calcareous. Again, Ben Averis will be doing that on the 29th of June. So check out our events page for that to sign up for that webinar. We've got heathland, which then breaks down into dry heathland or dry montane heathland. Again, Ben's already covered this in a webinar. Any ones that have already happened will be on the YouTube channel. We've got bog and wet heath, which then breaks down. And this one is particularly tricky. So, don't feel alarmed if you're like sitting there looking at your plot thinking, well, which one have I got? Blanket bog, raised bog, or wet heath? Because sometimes when they're poorly managed, they can actually easily be very interchangeable and not actually very characteristic of either one of them. But one of our volunteers recently had a situation like this. He sent through some photos of some of the species. I looked at it. Kevin Walker from Head of Science of BSBI had a look at it, and we were able to sort of roughly give him what we think that he should be marking it down as. We've then got Marsh and Fenn, so it's looking at whether it's acidic or base rich, so calcareous, and again that will be dependent on what species are present. We've got the freshwater habitat, so looking at the nutrient poor lakes and ponds or rivers and streams, for example. And then we've got rock outcrops, cliffs and screes, so inland rocks and scree and montane rocks and scree. Coastal, broken down into quite a few. So we've got coastal salt marsh, sand dunes, vegetated shingle, mahir, I'm never really sure how to say that, quite a rare habitat really, maritime cliff tops and slopes as well. This is just to give you a sort of idea of what the species lists look like and explain them a little bit. So here we've got Heathland, which is the broad scale habitat, and it has all of the indicator species that are under that broad scale habitat. And it also has which fine habitats you can find them in within, oh, sorry, just clicked on the screen. So within the fine scale for this one, dry heathland, which is obviously under the broad scale habitat heathland, you can see that there's a slightly shorter list because it's only the ones that are in this fine scale habitat. And as you can see here, that WF stands for wildflower, and it means that if there's a black wildflower little symbol in it, then it's just for wildflower level. The whole list is for indicator level, and obviously inventory is whatever's there, so you don't even really need the list, so to speak. And here's just whether it's a positive or negative indicator by a plus or a minus, and what page you can find it in the ID guide to have a look at the description of it. So hopefully that makes sense. So in terms of helping you with some of the ID, we've obviously got the specific ID guide, but as I said, that's only the ones that are listed for indicator and wildflower level. Whereas if you wanted a bit more, to check, oh, but could it be this species and it's not listed in the ID guide, then you might want to have your own ID book with you. The Wildflower Key by Francis Rose is extremely popular. And it is good. It's especially good, the key. However, some of the pictures are not, I wouldn't say ideal. So I mean, my personal recommendation that I use is the Collins Wildflower Guide, and you want to make sure you've got the second edition for this one because there's quite a few errors in the keys in the first edition. But I mean, it's a hefty book, as you can see. But why I find this really useful for me is that it has the grasses and sedges and rushes and ferns and horsetails in it as well. So I don't have to have a separate book for those. And I find the pictures are quite good. There's another thing, I suppose, that these days a lot of people have the plant ID apps on their phone, and when they first came out, they were pretty terrible. However, it's not something I've ever used that much, but a lot of people have been asking us about them. So we're going to be doing a new blog piece on the website about using the plant ID apps. I'm trialing 5, and my colleague Abby from Northern Ireland is trialing another 5. And I have to say, actually, I was pretty impressed with one of them called Flora Incognita, which I think is one of the only paid ones, but it's 89p, so it's not a lot. And I was really impressed. It managed to do some quite tricky species just from one image. I was very, very, surprised. So, that's another resource. And we have a few links to those on the app itself, for the NPMS app. It has some links to some plant ID apps. So that's useful to do. But I would always say have a book as well, because you never know when maybe the app's not getting it quite right. There are also lots and lots of training courses that are obviously mostly online at the moment, but in a normal year, they would be face to face, and you can look for ones that are in your region with the BSBI or the Species Recovery Trust, Field Studies Council as well. All of these online resources as well. They've got links to little crib sheets or to little videos about species. And obviously, we actually run face-to-face training in a normal year. We are putting a few up for the rest of the end of the summer. It's going to be more for an opportunity to meet other surveyors than anything else, because it'll be past the first survey point. But next year, let's hope that we're back to normal and we'll be running our full range of face-to-face events as well. So this is just to go through how to use the form. So this is the first page, the first side. So you obviously need to put in which of the survey levels you're recording at. So wildflower indicator or inventory, your plot number, the date that it is for your survey, the grid reference, your plot grid references, and then it wants to know what broad habitat, and hopefully you'll be able to also say which fine habitat you're in. And then it wants a few bits of information about direction of the slope, if there is a slope, or that sort of thing. Management description, so if that's obvious, you can write that down, or you don't have to put any of these, as they say, they're optional. Grazing, if there is any, do you think it's low, moderate, or high? Again, the guidance notes goes through the examples of those. How wooded is your plot? And then the vegetation height, which I mean, it's simply saying to give a score of 0, 1, 2, or 3 based on those percentages. And it's basically sort of saying if you've got, everything that's pretty much nothing is above 10 centimeters, then that's going to be number 3 in there, and it's going to be 0 for everything else. But it might be that you've got a bit of a mix. So you just roughly guess, which percentage you think it might fall into for each of those height categories. But you could always take a ruler out with you if you wanted to be really sure. But you'll get used to that. There's also space for any additional comments of what you might want to write, anything in particular. And then on the back, you've got your space for your plot sketch, which obviously then you could sort of take a photo of and send in, put on the website afterwards. And you've got then your space for your writing down your species name and the domain scale, which I'm going to go into in a bit next. So using the relevant species list for the levels and the habitat that you're looking at, you want to search your plot and see what species are present. So maybe start in one corner and then gradually move out to the rest of the square. And remember, try not to trample the plants too much, partly for the plant's sake, but partly because you won't be able to see what's there. And then regarding noting the domain scale, which sounds really scary, but it isn't, it's just simply a way of estimating the amount of ground that each space takes up as a percentage of the total area of the plot. So don't forget that obviously you're not just looking at the flowers, you're looking at the leaves as well, and to look beneath some larger plants because there might be plants underneath, because plants obviously grow in layers. Here it's suggesting that you could take, well, it's on the next one, sorry. Basically, you can take a piece of paper that you've measured to be 50 by 50 centimeters, and then that represents the sort of 1% of the square, and that can be quite useful. But here I've just given you sort of an idea. If you imagine that this is your plot square and we're looking down at it, basically you'd want to try and work out how much some of these species taken up. So the rough hawk bit, which is the yellow composite here, I mean, if you imagine that all squished up into one corner, but including the leaves, which are pretty dominant, I'm saying it's about 35%. Then we've got the oxeye daisies, a bit less, but there's still obviously lots of leaves at the base. And then we've got salad burnet, which is this one with the sort of reddish and greenish little pom-poms. Again, that's, taking up masses. There's quite a lot of that there. And then we've got a tiny species in there called fairy flax as well. And it's just about working out, roughly what you think that might estimate together. But honestly, it doesn't have to make 100%. It's not like you're trying to get to a certain total. They all grow in layers. And this sort of thing will come easier over time because you'll just get used to the percentage guessing. And it doesn't really matter if you think you're wildly out because they're within a range themselves anyway to allow for that sort of variation in judgment. But also, as long as you're pretty consistent across all of your surveys, then that's the key, really. And as I said, you could bring something that is 50 by 50 centimeters, as this represents sort of 1% of your 5 by 5 meter square. So you could kind of use it to visualize that if there was one species, do you think it would fit into more than one of those size squares, but not more than 4? Then, for example, you would know that you had a score of 3. But yeah, it's just a sort of estimate and judgment idea, really. So regarding the aspect and the slope, so if the plot occurs on a slope, then you record the main direction that the slope is facing from the normal compass range, north, northeast. Most phones these days have compasses on them, so you don't need to be sort of scrabbling around those old drawers trying to find your old compass. But equally, if you've got one, that's great. And then try, work out, is it flat or is it moderate or is it steep? And then you put a mark in for those. Um, Management is sometimes really obvious, but other times it's not so obvious. So are there obvious livestock, or is there evidence of ditch clearance, hedge cutting, coppicing, etc.? If there is grazing, how intense is it? So as I said, it talks about this in the guidance notes. Is there very short vegetation with no real stems or plants or anything, and loads of dung around, and you basically are struggling to find out what any of the plants are, then it's probably quite high grazing. Is it moderate? So, there's evidence of grazing, but actually the vegetation's mixed height and you can still see what some of the plants are. Or is it really low, in which case, there's not really much evidence at all, but you can see that something's been having a browse, or there's patches that maybe are rabbits or something. And then you just put in for other things like the domain scale for where there's bare soil, rock or gravel, litter, mosses and lichens. So I'm just thinking of some of the questions I've had recently. The mosses and lichens one, obviously going to be looking at the floor, but if you're doing a wooded plot, you will be looking to see, are there mosses and lichens hanging off the trees? And you'll be including that in your estimate as well. So it's not just at the floor level. The litter represents obviously leaf litter, but equally somebody mentioned the other day about their plot that was up on sort of with purple moor grass, and there was lots of sort of grass litter, if you know what I mean, old dead grass material that's all blown together. I mean, that could count as well, because I guess that's looking at sort of nutrient that's sitting there, for example. And then another part of the extra recording sort of form is looking at the vegetation height. So that's what we were saying before. So again, you can bring a ruler or you could just kind of guess. I mean, most people can kind of work out where a meter is off the ground and just try and work out how much your vegetation falls within those different heights. But again, it's important to say that if you're in a woodland, you're not including the main canopy trees in that. It's going to be looking at the sort of shrub layer and the ground floor below. What's next? Oh, and then you're sort of briefly a bit what equipment that you might want to take with you. So you really want to make sure you've got your survey form or your app if you're using it. It's worth taking your guidance notes out and the species list because you quite often need to refer to these, even though sometimes they're available online, or you've taken a screenshot or something. It's useful to have the actual ones with you. You might have a map, an OS map, or you might have just your map on your phone. Clipboard and pencils. I remember the clipboard is for setting up the plot, but it's also for leaning on to write. You need your tape measure or your pre-measured string and your plot corner markers. You want to have your ID guides, maybe a hand lens, just because some of the features that they want you to look at, sometimes you can't see that clearly with just your own eyes. The compass, but again, and GPS device, camera, they're all probably on your phone if you've got a smartphone. Obviously, if you don't, then obviously you might have to have these things separately. And the next thing is really to consider health and safety. So this is obviously particularly important as we want you to stay safe above all else. So please do not survey large bodies of water alone if possible. And obviously don't try to get in to see what that plant is that's just out of reach. It's just a plant. It's really not worth drowning over a bit of hornwort or something. Make sure that somebody knows where you are and how long you're expected to take, maybe where you've parked your car, and maybe have an arrangement with that person to sort of let them know when you arrive on site and when you're leaving. And if they haven't heard from you within a certain timescale, maybe what do they do next? Do they try calling you first? And then if they don't get through, do they call somebody else? And so on and so forth. And it's sort of like a buddy system, really. And obviously, you want to make sure that somebody knows if they really haven't heard from you by a certain time or they can't get through, then to call the emergency services. And obviously, it's times of COVID, so do bear in mind that you might want to keep your distance from people. You might want to take your hand sanitizer, etc. So there's a lot of help on the website for data entry, but this is obviously a really, really important process in this. And we've got step-by-step guides and YouTube videos how to help you put the data on. And obviously we've got our specific webinar as well for data entry. So register for that if you haven't already, or watch the webinar from before. We've also set up data surgery days, so you can book onto a one-to-one Zoom call with me and I can go through, and this doesn't have to be about data entry. This can also be about plot setup or plot creation, and I can help you do that part. And you can speak to sort of us about your specific queries that you have. And before all of that, if you're just unsure, just send me an email as well, and we can try and sort it out. We do have mentors as well that could help with some of these stages. So have a look on the website about that, and also a Facebook support group. So we've got our main NPMS Facebook page, but then under community, there's the support group, which is one that you have to get approval to be part of. But once you're there, you can then ask all the fellow surveyors various ID questions or plot questions, and lots of people will come to your aid. So there are two ways to submit your data. So there's via the website or, as I said, via the app. So as I mentioned before, the app just needs to have you set up the plots on the website first before you can start recording in the field. So if you're concerned that your plot is in a place with really bad phone signal, then don't worry, because the app is set up in such a way that it will let you do all your recording, and then it will sort of ping it off once you get within signal range again. The app's been updated recently, so a few extra features that we have um, include, as I say, the links to some of those apps, like the Grid Reference Finder apps, the Plant ID apps. That's under sort of the resources. There's the option now you can share your photos of species and your plot directly onto Twitter or other social media aspects. And there's also the really important part, which is the training mode. So if you're not sure about the app and you think, oh, I'm a bit worried, but I want to have a go, but at the same time you're worried about sending in data that's not accurate, there's now a training mode on there, so you can have a good old play, send off some data and stuff, and it's still all on the training mode. You just have to remember to turn out of training mode when you actually want to upload your data. And this is just to sort of show you what happens with the data. So ideally, we try and ask for everyone to send in their data by the 31st of October, Halloween. But it doesn't matter if you haven't. And equally, if you've still got data from last year and you're thinking, oh, cripes, I forgot to enter it, doesn't matter. We're still accepting all the data that you might have. So do, get on there and put it up whenever you can. It's just ideally that's when we start doing the analysis to sort of look at what's happened that year. But it doesn't matter if you can put it in after that. That's absolutely fine. But as it says, species data is verified by botanical volunteers, which is something we're actually going to be exploring with our mentors as well. So if you're a particularly good budding botanist and you think, actually, I'd really like to give some extra time here to the scheme, you could always become one of our verifiers, and that just, be looking at some of people's data and plants that maybe seem a bit more unusual for the places they are, and maybe photos and that sort of thing. Yeah, so just ways to find support. So you've got all of the information in your survey packs. We've got a whole resources page on the website, which has all of those survey pack documents there that can be viewed online as well. We've also got frequently asked questions, so do have a look at that before you email in, because it might be answered there. We've got the presentation about it. We've got the grid reference crib sheet, where you can find useful books and websites. And we've got our landowner letter here that you can download to send off for the various addresses. And we've got our list of mentors as well, the contact directory. And then there's a whole load of links to other habitat and species ID help. That's particularly good. The fern glossary and fern crib are really useful. And we've got our YouTube channel with all of the videos. We're also on all the social media platforms, and we can get back to you and help with anything as well. So as I said, we normally do face-to-face training. I will be doing some myself this year. I'm trying to cover most of the southwest because that's where I'm based. So I'm going to be doing one in Cornwall, in Wiltshire. We're doing our quality assurance event in Dorset, and I'm going to be doing an event in Somerset here. I'm also going to be doing one in West Sussex and in Warwickshire. However, we will also be running events up in Yorkshire, in Scotland, in Wales, all over with other people running the events. So they're all in the process of being organised. But as I said, we've far reduced our face-to-face this year, and they're sort of more later season in-field meetups with reduced numbers. But in normal years, we'll be running a full range of events all over, and then you can actually go out and learn how to do it in the field. And as we've got all of these webinars and everything as well, and our sort of virtual meetups with other volunteers are also there to be booked onto. So as I mentioned, we've got the YouTube channel. So do, check that out with all the how-to guides and everything. So it's really worth subscribing to that. And we also have the bunch of mentors that I talked about, that the directory list is on the website, and you can contact them for any queries you have on methodology, data and ID. So you can see where your latest one is, your nearest one is on the website. We're also on the lookout for new mentors as well. So if you feel like you could share your skills and knowledge, then do get in touch. Maybe you've got more, you're more technically minded and you might want to help some of our volunteers who struggle with the computer based elements of the scheme, and you feel like you could help them with that. That could be an element that you could help with. So do just get in touch. And if you want to find out any more, just obviously check out on the website. But that is the end for the moment. So I'm just going to monitor what everyone else has said. Right. I'm going to go look through the chat. So is it possible to offer a new square to the scheme? Yes. So we mentioned that So I was having a review of all the squares recently, and basically any areas that have got over 80% allocation already, we will be releasing some new squares. That's mostly in the southeast, I believe, where we've got quite a lot of allocations already. If it's in an area where there are still, sort of 30% or more squares available, then ideally we want those squares to be taken up first. But if there's a square near you, as I mentioned, that you're not, that is allocated and you're disappointed, contact me, because it might be that that person doesn't want to do that square anymore actually, and they just haven't released it themselves. So, it's worth sort of bearing that in mind. In terms of locating a square exactly where you need one, that's obviously not something that we can do because it's just not part of the methodology and it wouldn't really work. So, but do contact me and I'll see. Another question, whole square is open access land. Do I still need to work out who to get the landowner is? I'd say if it's open access, then probably not actually. It's a difficult one with public footpaths. I often get asked, or, if I'm going to do my, plot and I can access it via a public footpath, it's kind of a bit of a funny one really, because technically you're not allowed to step off a public footpath without permission from the landowner, which seems a bit crazy, but so in those circumstances, we probably say it's worth contacting the landowner. However, it's completely up to you if you feel like, this is an area that's constantly used and nobody would worry, then that's your judgment. The rules are slightly different up in Scotland as well. It's worth bearing that in mind because of the Right to Roam Act. And that particularly is covers for any citizen science recording schemes. It's, you're allowed to go and access land. But equally, if you know who the landowner is and you think that it'd be quite nice to tell them what you're doing, then by all means do. But I'd say if your whole square is open access, then that sounds great. Great square. What was the recommended plant ID app? Yes. So officially, I think my colleague Abby has probably the best 5 that she's looking at. But I know some people use something called iNaturalist, which she's testing, and PlantNet. But the ones that I've specifically been looking at, so that I can actually give some advice on, is so my top out of my 5 is Flora Incognita. So I'll just write it here. But I mean, I'm really impressed with it. I don't even remember how I think I just typed in plant ID apps into the App Store. But the great thing about it is that not only is it really, really good, so just give you a brief view of what it looks like. So this is what it looks like when you open it, and you can go identify a plant, and then you can choose whether it's a flower or a herb or a tree or a grass or a sedge or a fern, which is really useful. So you click on flower, and then it just asks you to take a picture of the flower from the top. And if it's not sure ever, then it asks for a photo of the leaf, but then usually it gets it within that point. The really good thing as well is it has a little section that's called My Observations. And when you go into that, it stores all of the photos that you've taken with the correct IDs. It has the date when you took it. It has the exact grid reference as well, because it's got that kind of data on it. I just personally find it really, really user friendly. It then has a species list option, which means that you could go in and search for a certain species and find out more information about it. So I think I tested it the other day on Bugle first, which it got absolutely first time round. So you could search for Bugle afterwards, for example. And when you scroll down, it gives you pretty accurate distribution maps and information of when it would be likely to be flowering and that sort of thing. Really useful. I then tested it immediately afterwards on ground ivy, and it got ground ivy. And I thought, well, those two are kind of similar. So yeah, very impressed with that. The other ones that I think I tried that came a second close was Plant Snap, but it's got loads of annoying adverts and it didn't get it right every time. So, and the other ones that I've been reviewing, to be honest, I'm going to not recommend that you even bother with, to be honest. But like Flower Checker and Leaf Snap, they were not, and Plant Lens, they were all rubbish, so don't use those. Let me look at some other questions here. Does grazing pasture count as semi-natural? So I've got lots of sheep, horses, cattle on my square. So this is a really difficult one, this actually, because technically, if it's always been like grazing pasture, then yeah, it's semi-natural grassland. If it's been sown at some point with like a grazing mix, then no. So it's kind of a combination of how much information you can find out about that habitat, but also what sort of species are there. So if it's just a complete ryegrass or desert, then you're probably not going to be able to include it as NPMS habitat. But if actually when you have a look down and you can see other little forbs and species that are there, then yeah, it probably could count as one of our neutral pastures and meadows. Um, but ultimately, there's the other question of, if it's very heavily grazed, particularly horses, they're often overstocked in smaller areas and they graze it like crazy. Are you going to be able to set up a plot, firstly, without horses trampling all over you? But are you going to be able to identify those species? So there's a few questions to bear in mind, but I would say that, yeah, it can count as semi-natural. I mean, a lot of the nature reserves still have their cattle and sheep grazing them all year round, and they're full of some of our rarest plants. So one of my numbers is in Broadleaf Woodland, but the right where the road dissects the wood. Can I move it into the wood? Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. As we said, those numbers are just plonked on based on that grid system. If you've got Broadleaf Woodland and you want to serve it, there's no point setting your plot up in the middle of the road. So definitely just move it along. All you have to do is remember to record that exact grid reference for the southwest corner of where your plot is. And obviously, by all means, you can call it plot number 13 or whatever that it was, or you could absolutely just call it plot number A or plot A, and call it your own name, no problem. So what would happen if you don't get a response from landowners or can't find the landowners? So there are 2 footpaths at the edges of the square, but the plots will probably have to be set up away from them. 1 footpath has been diverted as a big new poultry farm has recently been built. Yeah, so it is really difficult when it comes to the landowner stuff and you're not getting anywhere. So if you've already sent out letters to who you know owns the site, or pretty sure who owns the site, and you've got no response, then contact me. Send me the details of who you've tried contacting, and I will try again on your behalf. If you can't find the landowner, then definitely contact me because I might be able to do that. I'll do that on land registry for you, and I can find out exactly who owns it, and so we know. If, however, we've tried all of that and we still get no response, or we get a no, a lot of some landowners do say no, then we might need to relook at your square and see where else we can set up plots. So again, contact me about that. If, like, which happens rarely in cases, a whole square is owned by, say, one estate and the estate has given a blanket no, because unfortunately estates can be difficult about this sort of thing, then we can basically take that square out of scheme with a note to say that access is just, we can't get access to this site. It's worth noting though, if you're looking and you've got like an MOD site on your square and you're thinking, well, I'm never going to get access there, we actually have a really good relationship with the MOD, and we get access for our volunteers. You just have to do a few sort of tick box exercises of survey, sort of set health and safety stuff, and watch some boring videos. But yeah, we have quite a few people accessing MOD land. And I think that is all of the questions. And I hope I've managed to answer all of your questions. But I would say, oh, look at that. We're bang on schedule to finish at 1:15. So I really hope that you've all enjoyed it, whether you're new to the scheme or whether you were just wanting another refresher, or a chance to ask your questions. I hope that it's helped. And yeah, I hope that you can get out there and get surveying for us, and do let us know how you're getting on. Share photos with us, whatever you want to do. We'd love to know. Yeah, and good luck and happy plant hunting. Thanks everyone for coming. All right. Bye.